So, but I think I didn't say thank you to the Centre de Recherche de Versailles pour être ici. It's really important for us to show our research, especially intensive during COVID times, no, at home. And it's nice to offer all our research to the speakers, no, here and with Zoom. Here, I'm going to keep going, like Krista has said before, with ideas that I just briefly developed at the introduction about this idea concept of royal sites and royal geographies. This presentation has like two different parts. The first one is related with this concept and the evolution. And the second part is related with the types of royal geographies that we can find. Of course, I don't have time to develop everything, and in the publication, I will have time to do it, no? As I had said this morning, we consider royal sites, the concept of royal sites I'm going to talk about right now, related with the court system. This is a political system that the classical definition of court always said, at least in Spain, we studied like this, that the court was composed by the royal households, the councils, and the courtiers. But with our last studies about these royal sites or royal geographies, I guess that it's necessary, it's mandatory to introduce them like a fourth element, no, of this court. There's a key part of the court system. No? So as I have explained before, that it needs to be studied like a global concept, no? All these properties, not just the residences, and distinguishing between royal site with the idea I'm going to explain you right now, from the 14th century to the 18th century among the royal geographies. That's the difference. No? In the 19th century, like for example, Hurx has shown us that was the 18th century, but we can realize how it's changing, no? The role in society of these places. Of course, we have been researching in this for a long time. No? I am just going to show just briefly a couple of initiatives that myself I directed related with this. This was the first conference, European conference, was in York in 2017. That was the origin of the book that we are going to present on Friday. This one, Politics and Piety at the Royal Site of the Spanish Monarchy in the 17th century, where we analyze just this part, you know, how these royal convents and monasteries intervene in the spirituality of the different kingdoms of the Spanish monarchy, but I will speak about this briefly. And of course, we have seen this morning, Utrecht conference 2 years ago related with this. So what I mean is that what I'm going to say right now is just a brief, you know, survey of all these initiatives, but at the same time, it opens much more the things that still we have to develop. No, I mean, no, the whole court studies or historian of architects, art history, and so on. Briefly, we can say that the royal sites among the 14th and the 19th century, they cover like three main roles: this political role, social and economical role, and cultural role. I'm going to explain briefly how. Firstly, that these royal geographies were centers of power. Hayes has spoken about this before, but this idea comes from the Middle Ages. In the princely mirrors, for example, they adapted the idea of economica used to the court, the family, the extended family. Ruler was the pater familias and a virtuous person. So he was responsible of not just govern the royal household, no, and realm with moral authority and fair distribution of the resources, if not the material supply of the royal household. We will see after, for example, the pharmacies, they cover that need, for example. No? So the royal geographies were relevant as places of provision and representation of the authority of the royal power all over the kingdom in different places. We have spoken this morning, for example, about Castile, but not just Castile, if not Andalusia or Mallorca, for example. These houses were the most splendid and magnificent of the whole realm because they express the virtues of the sovereign. The Low Middle Ages is the moment that we started to see that they were not just residences split all over the kingdom. If not, they started to be an idea, a whole idea, a global concept of all these places, because they were really important for the European rulers because they could convert them in their temporary residences, but not only. If not, they established possession over territories that belong to the new political entities that they were forming, depending on the different kingdoms, and improve their organization through these institutions that we studied in Utrecht. So this institution started to shape the royal works, to have an initiative, a global idea of these places to represent the ruler, the sovereign, the dynasty, over the territory. In the 16th century, we found, still with this political role, next step is the expansion system of these royal geographies. We can say that they really create the sovereigns systems of royal sites or geographies due to the political, social, and economical potential that they have for this image. And they created an architectonical policy in the whole realm. In England, there are just 3 examples. In our book, in the future, we could find from Sweden, studies from Sweden, from other places, different, the Netherlands, and so on. And in the 17th century, what I have studied is that they converted these centers of power that helped to save the early modern European monarchies, especially those ones that were in crisis. No? It was a kind of extension of the court. I have studied myself for the Spanish monarchy, but I have seen the same in other ones because they merged the court, the household, and the territory. The bonds were tighter than before. There was a kind of exchange between the royal sites in Madrid, for example, Aranjuez, El Pardo, El Escorial, and so on. The people that work there could have the chance to go to the central court. And this happened in every court, for example, of the Spanish monarchy and other monarchies. No? The bonds were tighter than before. One example is that the validos or prime ministers of different places, different kingdoms, they convert themselves in the governors, direct governors of those places. For example, the Count Duke of Olivares or the Cardenal Mazarin here with Fontainebleau, for example. That was the political role. The social impact, Hayes has spoken a little bit more about this, but that means that they were, royal sites were micro-societies, especially in the 17th century. No? They differ with other European communities due to the special relation with the ruler and the dynasties, and they create these societies through different experiments because urbanistically talking, in Aranjuez, Versailles, for example, we have new developments related with the urbanism. And that, of course, affects the society. The impact of royal geographies in European social transformations, for example, they were places of courtly interaction, the etiquette and the ceremonial, especially in the 17th century, when the different kingdoms codified all these ceremonials, all these etiquettes, no? In France, in Spain, and so on. They express the moral qualities of court nobility and the magnificence of the palace, like we have seen before. But what is really important, and many times we don't take this into account, and they were places of innovative character. We're going to see after several initiatives that they were really innovative. We have the idea sometimes that the monarchy didn't let some countries to develop as fast as others. But in the 16th, 17th, 18th century was not like this, of course. And they were relevant spaces to study the development of early modern society, at least with comparison with other ones. And the people behave exactly the same in a court or in a royal site, for example, in Madrid, or, I don't know, for example, in Poland. No? They could behave the same way. Another social impact was this trickle-down effect. The effect that this morning, for example, with Jonathan Spangler's talk, when he was saying about the nobility came to the different royal sites of the Duke of Lorraine, Louis XIV made the same here at Versailles. It was a kind of reverse. They could see how it was managed, all these places, and they tried to do the same in their own lands. Here is just one example that was really well studied by Sanne Michaelberg, his postdoc related with Christa de Jong, about the Karel van Croailly. He created a whole system of sites and as well was shaped more or less like the king of that moment, the archdukes in this case, for example, for the Habsburg Netherlands. This codification of the court space by the royal favorites was split in 3 different places or spaces. Inside the residences, because they became the head of the royal chamber, for example. Outside the residences space with the royal stables, they were the high equerry, for example, of them, and the governorships of royal geographies. So they could control every space where the king was. This didn't happen in the 16th century. So we have to divide this idea. And as well, this fiesta, these celebrations that usually were outside, sometimes inside, there was a moment that they created a specific royal guards. The first place was here in France, the Garde du Dehors du Louvre, and they separate physically the space to the people outside. The king was not it was not necessary for the king to show himself outside of the royal palaces as it was mandatory before. No? So the transfer inside the fiesta through these royal guards, and a part of that, they created like court theaters inside these royal sites. There are some examples there. The scenarios for illusionists or plays, or the adaptation of royal gardens to all that. We don't have to go really far for this. At the same time, I have said, this codification of the Palatine space in the 17th century completely saved this. And the royal residences, the royal geographies, show quite clearly the interlink between all these elements. No? So ceremonial etiquette was the representation of society. And in that moment, the society most of the feast or the place were inside a royal palace, inside the royal geographies. Of course, there were others outside, but mainly inside. This is related with the three roles I have checked for these royal sites among the 14th century and the 18th, more or less. After that started the crisis. Now we are going to see really briefly these types of royal geographies. There are many, because sometimes we don't think about that. Though. So I feel in the mood of doing this, because this was necessary. Of course, the royal residences. Palatium has studied this really deeply. In Germany, has been studied and so on. So I'm not going to keep going really much with this. But there were enormous variety of types. And what is important is the continuity with the medieval times, with other reigning dynasties before the ones in the early modern times. We have seen some examples this morning, for example, in La Alhambra de Granada. No? To keep going, they represented the presence of the king, his household, and his family in every corner of the realm. This is really important, for example, in composite monarchies like the Spanish or the Portuguese ones, because the king in the 17th century was not, at least for example, the Spanish case, was not outside of the Iberian Peninsula. But for example, we will speak about this on Friday, there were courts in Barcelona, there were courts in the Netherlands, there were courts in Naples, Sicily, so they needed a royal residence. Who was there? Usually was the viceroy or the governor general, a kind of delegate power from the king in those places. No? So they really represented that. For example, the viceroy of Mexico and Peru, they stopped in Sevilla, in the Alcázares, and it was the banner of the king, like the king was there, not the virrey. So the royal household were concentrated in this constellation of residences. I have established like three circles of residences. The central one, of course, the main one, usually there was just one in the 16th century, but it was complemented by another one in the 17th century. Alcázar de Madrid, Buen Retiro, for example, no? They needed. Here was the same with the Louvre, and after Versailles, it was the same with the Hofburg, for example, is Homeroom. So there were many examples. Each one of the royal sites in the secondary, like the blue, we can see there, circle, accomplished a different task in the supply of the royal household. Not all of them were for hunting. Some of them were for other kind of things. For example, some colleagues at my university, they have studied that there was one in Granada where they take the wood, a special kind of tree, for the back part of the cannons for the Spanish army. So that was part of the supply, no? And of course, you know the journeys. That there was the center, the capital for winter, and there are many other residences in other places. And the third circle was related with these places outside the capital or some residences for other members of the royal family. No, the sons, nephews, for example, widows, and so on. Here we have the second example, the royal forest. We always talk about gardens, but we don't take into account the royal forest and woodlands. In Utrecht, it was studied, no? Of course, they were necessary for building the presence of the sovereign in the territory and for maintaining the presence of him. They established an administrative framework to mark the limits and as well the jurisdiction. This is really important, really hard to study, of course, but is one of the things that need to be studied, no? And the economic exploitation, the good, of course, the rental of lands, sometimes for people, the agricultural and forest products. For example, it's really well known how many exotic products for America, for example, of Asia, they were introduced in Europe through this royal forest or the gardens, no? And the upkeep of the royal residences, not just the royal residences, but especially for the royal residences. we have the gardens and farming spaces. Of course, there were dwellings and leisure places, of course, but at the same time were spaces for innovation and cities of scientific initiatives. These laboratories or pharmacies, for example, at the Spanish royal household, every people that work for the royal household receive the medicines. No? So in these places, in Aranjuez, in El Escorial, there was a pharmacy, there were plants, special plants over there, they did the medicines and they split, no? They give them to the different members of the royal households. The orangerie, of course, orangeries, the different ones, the greenhouses for scientific initiatives, not just for leisure, if not for this. The menageries, for example, like kind of zoos, no? When they have this kind of animals, but it's not just for being a zoo and see them, if not to sometimes make, this sounds really bad, but make experiments with them, no? To mix through several species and to know what was going on, for example, no? Libraries and archives. This morning we have been speaking about archives. In Valencia, for example, the archive of the kingdom was inside the royal palace. Libraries, I wanted to show the one of El Escorial, of course, but what is interesting is in many cases, the germ of today's national libraries were these ones. First were personal collections of the kings, then passed to be these libraries in the royal sites, and then passed to be the national. For example, Austria, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, and so on. Laboratories and pharmacies, we have said, the Wunderkammers, or cabinets of curiosities, of course, they were for personal pleasure, but at the same time was the symbol of power and prestige, and at the same time, rare and curious objects that not all the people have the chance to have at the places. So you could go there. For example, the one in Innsbruck is amazing, no? For example. The royal stables we have in front of us, no? Some of them, not just to have the horses there or the cars or the chariots or whatever, if not at the same time to do this kind of experiments. For example, the caballerizas, the stables in Córdoba, they created the kind of horse that is called today the Spanish horse. It was to use that in the ceremonies and all that. In Naples, for example, or at the Holy Roman Empire. The armories. The armories were included at the royal stables. I mean, like a part of the royal household. No, it was a part. This is the one in Madrid, but we can find many others, no? But they crafted and stored the arms used by the royal household for hunting, warfare, or the tournaments in the 15th century, and in the jousting in the 16th century. The religious buildings, as we are going to speak on Friday, the royal chapels, for example, like this one, but not only the chapels, if not the royal convents and monasteries. They were really important for the dynasty. Talking about spirituality, but as well, like you can see here, like pantheons of the dynasty, like a symbol of the dynasty. It's really interesting, the case of the monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial, because it passed to be a pantheon of the Habsburg dynasty to be the pantheon of the Spanish kings. That change is really important. For example, no? They were reliquaries, host confraternities and brotherhoods. And in most of them were like nuns, were members of the royal family, for example. And lastly, the economic exploitation. The royal mints, the royal coin mints, for example, were considered royal sites. This one is in Segovia, but you can find in Mexico, in Tyrol, and so on. And the windmills, the tolls, the bridges, the water infrastructures, and so on. And lastly, the defensive and military exploitation. No, the shipyards, the English manors, the arsenals, the Arsenale in Venecia, the Guadalnaus in Lisbon, for example. So we have many examples of this. And the royal manufactories, the first one, of course, was here with Colbert in France in the 17th century, but in the 18th century, they split to many different places, including Spain and other ones, firstly, to produce luxury goods and military items, but as well for a kind of source of prestige and possible exports to other monarchies. In conclusion, we have been working in this for several years, but still there are a lot of things to do, a lot of things to study for doing this research. Thank you very much.